we've been talking about land banks in Maine for a little while, and we'll be using this forum through Build Maine to do that. Last Thursday, we presented on Sanford's land bank, as well. George O'Keefe from Reverted presented on their land banking activities they do. Land banking in general is returning properties back into productive use. We were talking through some of the law changes that would be necessary to put a land bank in effect locally. It's something that you can do in the state of Maine currently, but there are additional steps that could be taken to facilitate that at the state level. So Sanford modeled the enabling legislation for housing authorities and urban renewal authorities under Title 30A. There's ways that we can strengthen that. Additionally, Michigan has, for example, fast track authority to address abandoned properties or properties that can't be dealt with through normal foreclosure processes. That's important. And then additionally, we talked about what some preliminarily what the state's role would be in land banking. And today, since Michigan has had a land bank for a number of years, and we're fortunate to have Jim on the phone with us and presenting today, he's going to talk through a lot about what that state level land bank role is, and then talk a little bit about how the financing works on that, some of the issues related to environmental liability, how title transfers, and how ultimately you can use a land bank to move properties back into productive use. So if you wanted to reach out to me directly, you can. You can also access the last week's presentation on YouTube under Build Maine, and feel free to reach out. We've got a very good working group right now currently. We're represented by 3 of the Council of Governments throughout the state. Rumford's been also helping us, as well as Caribou, and we're open to more support. We're currently trying to connect with the state as far as what the state's involvement might be if we were to proceed with a state level land bank in the state of Maine. So I'll hand it off to Jim.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Couple of housekeeping questions first before I get started. First, everybody can see the presentation on screen, correct? Okay, Mandy shaking her head, yes. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, good. Second is that I think I heard you correctly. You're gonna, Mandy, you're gonna monitor Q&A and put it out there if questions come forward, which can be at any time, no problem. Okay, and Ian, you're still sticking around because there might be some specific questions that come to you on behalf of the working group, correct?
I am here. I am here.
Got it. Okay. All right. That's all I need. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for having me involved. It's been a pleasure to be of help to the Build Maine working group and the collaboration in general going all the way back to last summer. There have been, if you haven't been with us to date, there have been a couple of webinars, excuse me, and they are on the Build Maine website, which lay the groundwork for this prospect or the prospect of having a land bank, or you'll start to see me, or you have already heard me talk about this concept of land recycling. Today's discussion is going to pick up on one of the topics that came out of the Q&A last week in the session, which was the basic question: if land banking is intended to be focused as a local level activity, what is or can be the role of a state beyond enabling legislation to assist local practitioners, local land banks, local municipalities that engage in land banking to do the work? And so in response to those questions that came up, I've prepared some material on slides here. It should be about a half hour in presentation time, and then we can go into Q&A. There are a couple other topics that came up as well, they may be subject to some future communication and or sessions. We'll leave that to be decided at a later time to go. So what we're going to cover today is I want to take everybody a half step back. There might be folks that either have not seen or have not had a chance to digest completely the previous material that has been covered the past 2 weeks. So not to go too deep into the background, but we'll refresh everybody's memory on such. The second area of discussion is perhaps a start on talking about what is or what exists today, but what could as well be the relationship between state and local governments. In this case, it'd be land recycling, but it could portend into other activities. And what I'm referring to is the other work of Build Maine with systems mapping and analysis and life cycle capital planning, all those areas. Those, as I see them from my perch here, 800 miles away from you, and our local experience, we have more and more seen the need to have a two-way, multidimensional engagement with local practitioners, local governments, and it's a different model than perhaps what has been practiced between state and localities for the up to the recent past. So we'll talk about that, and at least give you some food for thought. Then we'll come into what I see or we see here from my perches being some of those key areas of roles where the state can provide direct support for or with or on behalf of locals to help the land recycling process move. And then the end of this presentation is going to start to push forward some discussion topics that, or at least in such particularly funding, which could portend again to another discussion if there's desire by the working group or by the audience to have those. And of course, your questions are welcome at any time, or your comments, unless you decide to tell me that the presentation is not good, Jim. Then we don't want to hear your questions. No, I'm teasing you all to go. All right, we'll go back to get a refresher here. What is a land bank? Well, there are multiple different structures that exist across the country. But if you were to categorize them into general areas, first and foremost, they would be public or quasi-public or governmental. In some cases, they might be nonprofits established by governmental units, entities that are created at local community or at regional or multi-community levels. Their purpose is to deal with the acquisition, management, and repurposing of the properties that in previous conversations, you've raised your hands and your feet to identify that you have in your town or in your city, which are either contaminated or blighted or obsolete, or some combination of distress factor, which has on those, which attaches to those properties. So the land bank's in structure is intended to be an interim, short-term defined not by a time period, but interim in terms of going from previous ownership and condition to future productive reuse in that interim status. They're intended to, and they have operated mostly to either create or in some cases replace systems where pursuant to statutory authority, local governments would sell taxes or sell liens on taxes, where some folks in the market might think that there's merit to that. The large scale evidence of research has shown that speculative auction or process system has led to exacerbated some of the issues that we've seen today with these types of properties. Not finally, but certainly to clear or to quiet title, clouded or encumbered title and property, because getting past the physical distress factors that you might think or know about which would attach to a property, the documentation problem exists still, which is to obtain clear, quiet, marketable title to move a property out of interim stage into that productive reuse under title ownership. So at very base level, those are the rational things. This slide you also saw from a previous presentation, but I've updated it only briefly. This would represent the present time growth or status of how the land banking movement has moved across the United States. From early stage activity from some of the pioneering communities, not listed here, but they would be Cleveland and St. Louis and Akron, Ohio, into the state enabling statute route, which you see here listed. One of the patterns to notice is that since 2010, the growth of states which have enabled land bank entities to form has been growing, which is a positive sign. I have highlighted in yellow Michigan and Alabama because those are the only two states that under their statutes have authorized the actual formation of a state level land bank. We don't think that it's a function of not wanting to have a state level land bank, but most of the work, most of the action is happening in your town, in your city, in your community, where those transactional activities are most likely to happen. And so that's where a key principal focus of land banking has been to go. But I do want to talk briefly statutorily about what these two states in Alabama, couple years back, the legislature reestablished. There was actually some local home rule authority devised about 10 years prior to 2007, 2008 to authorize locals to create land banks, but there was never any rules or process promulgated after the statute was adopted. And so in 2018, the legislature in Alabama reestablished through new legislation the ability to create land banks, and in that process authorized the state land bank to come into existence and tasked that state land bank to work with locals to deal with the acquisition and selling of tax delinquent properties, very similar to the practices and the issues that we have just been talking about, to return those properties to best use. The Alabama statute provides that municipalities, and that would be cities or even counties, that have more than 1,000 or 1,000 or more tax delinquent parcels, that they would have standing to form a local land bank. So far, to my knowledge, it's my understanding that Montgomery and Tuscaloosa have formed land banks, and there may be a few other ones that have formed in Alabama. But the structure of those local formations are tied to an intergovernmental agreement relationship with the state land bank. In talking to a colleague of mine who from Alabama, who I've had a chance to talk to, he sent me some material. This goes back about a year ago or so, which was very instructive. That quote that you see on this slide here, and I'm going to read it directly, which is, currently many of these properties, referring to parcels in that state, which they have issues ranging from bad titles or ownership questions to blatant disrepair. Until these issues are addressed, they will continue to negatively impact property values in communities across Alabama. Whereas one might think that that would be the government agency or government leadership talking about that, the fact is that that was the state's Association of Realtors, which was and has been one of the principal supporters of the land banking movement there in that state, which is not surprising as much as who the party is, as much as where their role is in the real estate process, which is right there in the mix on transaction valuations and movement of properties. And as a practitioner group, it's very advantageous and beneficial to see that their advocacy for the need to have land banks. Now in Michigan, we again covered this is in a previous presentation, but the legislative intent you see here in summary has been to enable the state and local governments to do the same things we've just been talking about. Assemble or dispose of property, clear and quiet title, acquire, assemble, dispose, provide for financing to acquire those. The Michigan statute creates the state authority, and it also creates a mechanism through intergovernmental arrangement for locals, in our case it's counties, to form land banks, because counties are the foreclosed governmental units in Michigan, and a state land bank. And we'll talk, I don't have the specifics of actual steps in this presentation, but what I will tell you briefly is that the way that it operates here is that when a local foreclosing governmental unit, or FGU, a county, wants to create a land bank, they take a vote action at their governing body board level. And if they do that, then they engage a discussion with us, the state, and we enter into an intergovernmental agreement whereby we confer the powers to land bank to that county. We do not give up our power, but we allow for them to, in fact, engage the power too on their own properties they foreclose upon. And then it also lays out some of the categories of where assistance and guidance and process support can be undertaken between the state and the local governments. Now, the question that we've talked around a little bit is, isn't this land banking stuff a local activity? And the first answer is, of course it is. It's a activity which is going to be tied to neighborhood, to community, to region, because real estate development and the regulation of how land is developed, zoned, affected, it all takes place at local level. However, one or more of these issues, be it due diligence, the due diligence is a catch-all phrase for environmental due diligence, contamination assessment, phase 1, phase 2, or market due diligence, market analysis, target market analysis, or physical due diligence, which is geotechnical analysis. And there could be one or many different ways, but due diligence may be an issue in a local community, in particularly the ability to be able to successfully undertake all the aspects of due diligence. A site, based upon what is found in due diligence, might have one or more distress factors attached to them, and we've covered that previously. There could be political issues, and political issues could be that there's the local community or the governing body that perhaps may not want to or may not believe or feel that it's in their realm to actually get into this activity. Here in my neck of the woods, I've heard that conversation. We've had this conversation with locals. You'll see in our maps, not all the counties in Michigan for various reasons, but politics is one of them. There are responses to some of those political issues, but they exist out there. And I think not the final, but the most important issue that we find, I'll use that phrase, capacity. Local communities may have problems or issues amounting appropriate budget, or any budget, or personnel, or time. A time capacity issue, as I have locally heard it described by treasurers and practitioners here, is that they have day jobs. They are practicing and working their constitutional or statutory activities or ordinance activities adequately, or because of financial factors within their community, they are doing 1+ jobs in that community. And so this prospect of land banking, it may just be a overcapacity issue for them, let alone a personnel or budget capacity. So if we can think of the relationship between state and local government on the pyramidal structure that you see in this slide, at least in this state, we have a growing realization and practice relationship across multiple dimensions between the state and state agencies and local governments as being two-way, and and when two-way, it's intake and response back, and the multiple dimensions would encompass not just grant or loan programs or regulatory review processes, but it is becoming more and more an engagement here where the state has coming to realize that it has a stake in providing direct or indirect or even direct capacity support to local units of government to affect the affairs that benefit local communities across the state. Because local communities, constituted or chartered as they are still creatures of the state. And so with this area of recycling and redevelopment and land banking in Michigan, we have taken a very proactive role through our system set up by our statute to provide that benefit to local units of government. There are, so far, 4 major areas where a state level land bank can play a role, both itself and also on behalf of local governments. I'm going to talk about them mostly in pictures with some narrative so you can get a sense of what I mean. The first area would be to act as more or less a real estate agent, be it development, redevelopment, or title holding for state lands themselves. As I go through these coming slides, I'm going to ask you to think about your state. I know I have mostly Mainers in this session today, but there could be other states as well. But think about your state agencies and the land parcels they have. And more than that, think about the surplus parcels that of state agencies, lands that may be out there, or maybe not. But I'll bet you probably can think of at least one surplus property that's not being used and or will never be used or was previously used and is in a redevelopment scenario with a state-owned parcel. Second category would be distressed or distressed issue properties. They run the range between contaminated properties or blighted or obsolete or some other factor, and there could be combinations on those. So we'll talk about, show you how we are involved with those. Third, building upon what I mentioned just previously, is how we can and do support both in statute and in a contractor agreement and in process the locals, not just land banks, but local units of government as well. And fourth is our ability to the S words, either to share the standardized or systemized actions and processes that we develop, respecting that local units, local land banks can of course can affect what their own choice of how to process for disposition and acquisition, but that there are some common factors of which we can play a role in terms of documentation and process support to help them as well. All right, so in this first realm of being a repository or an agent redeveloper of state lands, I'm going to show you some pictures here. And again, some of them are repeats from a couple weeks back, but the state here, state of Michigan, has 19 different state departments, and all of them, or almost all of them, are in the business of providing service to the public. And in the provision of their service to the public, they may or do acquire or operate on lands that at some point may move through their useful life and become designated as surplus. This example I'm showing you here is a surplus property that the Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS, has had no further use for. And because what they're in the business of providing health and human service support for individuals and households in the state, what they are not constructed or designed to do is to move through a land transaction or disposition process. Of course, they could do an RFP and ask for local, or ask for proposals to be submitted for use of these properties. This one perhaps has a little bit, I wouldn't call this a distress factor, but if you look at that picture on the right, you see the area where the buildings are located, but you also see a large green area. That also happens to be a floodplain area adjacent to the river that goes along the southeast part of the property. So easily 80% of the property is not does not have any utility for development activity. So because of some of those factors, the decision and the structure in our state has been that these types of properties, instead of just going out to bid for redevelopment use on low bid amount by the state, that they instead would be moved to the land bank and we would engage in a real estate redevelopment site prep due diligence process to position them for redevelopment. And in fact, this property did successfully move to a redevelopment about 2 years ago with a partial rehabilitation and partial new build. And by the way, the floodplain area was we made disposition at the request of the local town because they had a plan to expand their town park, which is just to the northeast of this site, we made disposition of that property to the town to expand their park into this floodplain area for passive and active recreational purposes for the grand total of $1. Okay. Again, this is a slide some of you have seen before. This is a surplus Department of Corrections facility, aka a prison. This is a prison camp. If you're familiar with corrections facilities, you have different types of facilities. This is a camp. This camp, which is the developed area of this campsite, which you see on the right-hand image, is only 1/4 of the entire acreage that this property was. The rest of it was wooded for adequate buffer. This property is one of more than 20 surplus corrections facilities across to Michigan, which are in the process of going through a legislative action to move to the land bank so that we can proceed with development due diligence, planning, RFQ requests, and redevelopment support and disposition. Excuse me. The 4 of them transacted back in 2000, at the end of 2018. This is the last of the properties that is, well, literally last Friday, we came to close on back at the end of last year, we did a comprehensive RFQ, selected a development team. We entered into a multi-stage development agreement for this site. This prison camp property just closed last Friday for the phase 1 for this development. And a quick sidebar, the manufacturing party that's going to go into this site in this first phase, they're going to start immediately producing equipment to support the COVID crisis here in Michigan, which is all a good thing, as you might anticipate. Taking surplus properties is not the only reason or activity that we perform for state agencies. Near Marshall, Michigan, and down in the lower left part of this slide, I'm trying to show not the specific parcels, but the area which is in the vicinity of interstates 94 and 69. The land bank has an easement for approximately 4,000 acres of land. This is the designated mega industrial site location for Michigan. What that means is that, like a number of states, as part of their economic development strategy, when or if a big industrial manufacturer or other party comes a calling for a site for a new build or a relocation or expansion, that Michigan, like many of the states, is ready to go. We have a development ready with infrastructure site. And so our property, our site is, again, that almost 4,000 acres in and around this interchange, of which the land bank has title or has easement title under agreement, of which, if that project ever comes to be, we have the ability to immediately move to close on those easement agreements and option easement agreements to make the project go to support our large-scale economic development proposal or project, were it to be. And during the present time, of course, it still remains being active farmland in this case. I'm going to move now from surplus and state aid properties to large distressed properties. This is a really key role. In our opinion, in my personal experience, I have found that some of the distressed properties, mostly contaminated properties, but not always, it could be obsolete or blighted or other factors, that the large scale sites, I could give you my opinion, it might be 100+ acres, but that's just a number for you to hear today. It doesn't have to be necessarily that. It's really the size of the issue and the size of the property in combination. That these large properties, more often than not, become, despite the best interests and intents of local practitioners or even land banks, that these sites have cost and factor issues that are just too great to be adequately addressed at the local level. And that's a role that the state, through its land bank, can and does play. So, for example, on the left-hand side, an area that was found was a part of a large state DNR park property or holding until about 7 years ago, when it was learned that multiple portions of the property were actually unlicensed fill sites, not from the 20th century, but from the 19th century. That those areas were fenced off because they represented a potential threat to the human public welfare and safety. And that portion of the property was deeded by the DNR over to the land bank, and we have present title of that property subject to due diligence assessment and future repurposing. We don't know what that repurposing is going to be. On the far right side is from our Upper Peninsula. Just about every state has former military property, they be them active or former Air Force or Army bases, or they were missile sites, missile silo sites and such. In this case, this is Keweenaw, the former Keweenaw Air Station, which is almost at the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula in the UP near Lake Superior. Those sites became abandoned. In many cases, they were turned over to local jurisdiction. But back to the issue I mentioned just a minute ago, which is they may, or in this case, this is just beyond the technical and financial capacity of Keweenaw County to be able to handle that. And so that property is transferred over to the land bank, and we are in process of assisting Keweenaw County in the start of the assessment work for that property. Some of you might recall the federal programs that came out of the Great Recession, be it hardest hit out of the TARP funding or other sources of funding. There was a large amount of dollars available, and in a number of states, they utilized the access to those dollars to deal with blight or abandonment or vacancy issues. Michigan was a significant player in that role, and in a number of communities, you can see here 43 counties and 60 plus communities where they made requests to the state or because they demonstrated, had previously demonstrated that they did not have sufficient capacity. The state went ahead and as applicant and practitioner or practicer on our behalf, we as the land bank utilized those funds to acquire and demolish and to site prep many properties to the tune of more than 1,500 properties across the, 1,600 properties across the state. So we have a long track record to the tune of that $84 million of activity that we had with the federal program in 2010. But what that has left us with is a number of smaller parcels in distressed area neighborhoods. Most of them are in Southeast Michigan, not in Detroit, but in areas surrounding Detroit. But majority of those 43 counties and more than 60 communities, we have parcels that look like what you see on the left-hand side, meaning that they're vacant, they've been demoed. And when I say demoed, they've been demoed below grade. In other words, not just to grade leading basement. Our demolition work was to pull move the bits of structures and remove the foundations so they were redevelopable. And over time, we have been taking what I consider the onesie-twosie approach, where we either have local neighborhood developer or other developer assemble properties for redevelopment. A local neighborhood project example is what you see on the right side, which is just down the block from the vacant lots that you see on the left, where a local neighbor organized a nonprofit collaborative to begin to do side lot garden and beautification projects along that street. The state, today, the state Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, or EGLE, E-G-L-E, I'm going to refer to DEQ probably because that name change occurred just when the administration turned over here a little over a year ago. But back 3 years ago, then the DEQ in Michigan, our Environmental Enforcement Agency, and in particular our Remediation and Redevelopment Division, entered into an agreement with us, the land bank. And you can think of it as a back and forth agreement. meaning that we might get control of property through a means of enforcement or other, which would meet the CERCLA standard. We've talked about this in a couple of in the 2 previous meetings, which is that if a governmental entity affecting their power, their sovereign power, takes a police power or other health, welfare, and safety action of which they gain control of the property, that generally that acquisition is going to meet the innocent landowner, and meet the innocent landowner defense because the government was assuming its duty as a sovereign in that case. And because of that change in the law, the RDEQ and we entered into an agreement which allowed for us to work back and forth between properties, where if we had a property which was already understood to be contaminated, we have about 7 parcels, large parcels in our inventory, which are Superfund sites, for example, that by definition, the land bank would not be a responsible party, which makes sense, but we have an agreement which is backed up by our MOU between EPA and the state of Michigan supporting it as well, to be the case. And the opposite side, or the opposite side of that agreement is that if the now Eagle, former DEQ, gets a control of a property or has to get control of a property, which is a hazard to the human health and environment, that they now have a repository to hold title to that property, which absolves a conflict of interest on the part of the Environmental Enforcement Agency, because that's what they do. They enforce environmental regulations, and it's tough for them to enforce upon themselves. So that for those reasons, the agencies entered into an agreement. And the pictures I'm showing you here, starting in the lower right, I've been joking with some of the, or teasing with some of the work group members here. If you were to Google green ooze and Michigan, you would find some of these pictures, whereas down in the lower right, it was discovered back in November of last year that there was liquid coming out of a berm, as you see over here, down off of one of the Detroit area freeways, expressways, which was traced back to a abandoned industrial plant, which is up here in the upper hand right. And when the state went in to do an emergency investigation, what they found was in the lower left that the owner, who happens to be in federal prison right now, had their industrial solvent disposal process was digging a 10-foot pit into the earth in the basement and depositing the liquid there, which you can now assume leached through the soil and began to come out at the lowest point, which is at that expressway berm or that expressway base wall location. That is the green ooze property. Literally last week, we had a meeting electronic with Eagle staff where we agreed at their request that because they have gone into court to obtain immediate control of the property from the owner, and upon receipt of a grant of a judgment of title, which is going to come any day, the Eagle, the state agency, will transfer that property to us, the land bank, and we will hold the property so that they can continue to engage in their cleanup and enforcement actions, both their funds as well as federal funds. So what I'm presenting to you here is that relationship between land bank at state and other state agencies is not just a land repository on surplus, but in this case, it's a proactive positive benefit to the public to set up sites to get them cleaned up prior to redevelopment and reuse. I'm going to move over now to supporting our local land banks. This map you see on this slide is actually a map where in green we have all of the state land banks, all the counties, that have state land banks, of which almost over half of the counties in the state do have land banks. And it might be tough for you to see, but 8 of those counties are crosshatched. What we do as part of our arrangement and our statute is this, because those 8 counties do not foreclose on properties. They do not have sufficient capacity to actually have us in county or in FGU, foreclosing government unit status, to move on tax foreclosures, the state of Michigan actually does that work for them, and those properties come directly to us, the state land bank. We also provide additional support to locals, and I'll explain what I mean by these different services. For QTA, which is quiet title activity, we offer that service to all counties and all land banks as they request to us. Our document library, which includes all of our agreement templates and process and planning support templates, same thing. They are available at simple request by all locals or all land banks at their request. We as the state, because we have approximately over 2,500 properties in total, in addition to this, we have 800 on top of the 1,600 small lots, as I mentioned to you. We routinely, over a 2-year basis, bid out our property maintenance services, and on those contracts on the contract that we sign on lowest cost bid, we allow for locals, if they wish to participate to benefit from the cost and task savings as a rider to the contract we have with the selected vendor or vendors. And we have vendors across all the regions in the state. Assuming we have funding, and up until the present time, we have had funding. I'm not sure we'll have funding, at least for the foregoing next few months. We have had dollars available for locals or land banks or municipalities to come and borrow from us at very low interest rates to start planning for redevelopment projects to go. And that's been a very interesting alignment that might occur with an EPA assessment loan, which would set up for site prep work to do an actual development project, or some other factor where it could leverage with others. Because it's state money, it can be utilized and aligned with other sources to make projects go. Due diligence work, be it market or financial or environmental due diligence. In our consultant selection processes that we run and repeat every few years, we have a state contract provider in those agreements where a local can have access to the vendor that we've talked to or that we've come to agreement with at the rates and the schedules that we have negotiated with those as well. And finally, we, as requested, can and will service any and all locals or land banks to actually go through proactive pre-development, development, finance structure, and construction monitoring assistance and post-development consultation. That's one of the key roles that my staff and I do in the development operations section of land bank, which is more or less to be development consultants to any and all local units across the state that ask us to have that service. Our intergovernmental agreements allow for a local land bank to directly request our engagement down to time and material services, and technically it can include short-term remote staffing for specific project and program assistance. The reason that, amongst the reasons that we have this type of support, it hits the need that I mentioned earlier, which is some communities, as much and as interested and as desirous as they have, may not have the budget, personnel, or time capacity or other factors which preclude their ability to do this work themselves. As such, the state, through the land bank, can and does provide that support service. In the first presentation, I talked about the idea of land banking, not land banking with respect to moving through a property through redevelopment, but simply holding title. That aggregation of surplus and publicly owned properties is actually a good thing because it centralizes the repository to enable for proactive intake or input or disposition of those as well. So amongst our library of templates available are a series of land banking agreements, which are escrow format title transfer agreements, meaning that control, if community A wanted to vest title in the land bank, state land bank, that we would enter an agreement with them where we would come to close and we would simply hold title, which might be program-wise or process-wise advantageous to them, but they still would have control over what happens to that property. In that respect, we are effectively acting as an escrow. That's where the concept of escrow format land banking comes from, which has in transfers. And just last fall, for example, the city of Grand Rapids, which is the second largest city in Michigan, entered into a arrangement with us where they are doing that. They, as they get control of properties, they want to hold them in our land bank for aggregation and for strategic development and disposition at their control when they decide to make those properties or those projects or those parcels move to make the projects happen, which is good for them and it's good for us. It's a service that we provide to the local units. This map here represents all of our consulting work across close to 60 local units across the state, where we are teaching or training or helping them organize projects where they can use tax increment financing to cover housing subsidy gaps, aka affordable housing, for homeowner purchase or even rental projects. This is a topic we can talk in more details another time. But what this map is intended to show you is that our consulting work, both to teach, train, and consult on projects, runs the entire range across the state. As I like to say, my playing field is pretty large, and we like doing that. It gives us variety and also gives us the ability to make a lot of people happy, because if they have project opportunities, they may not have the ability to do those projects, and we can help support them doing that. Okay. 2 meetings ago, we talked about this concept of domicology, right? It's the scientific term for life cycle of buildings or the built environment, which is a recent term. But if you remember, if you watch that presentation, seeing this graphic down there on the lower left, I showed that because that's where the research has been to date, talking about how properties go through life cycle. And if they are not sufficiently maintained or secured or supported, that they fall into this negative declination of status and activity, leading towards it being left for taxpayers to deal with. What we have been talking about since then with land banking is really the front half of the land recycling process, where properties or buildings on properties which approach or are at the end of their life cycle are in a situation where, for the most part, the government needs to engage a process to get control and to undertake a number of actions, which are in this square right here, which I'll entitle recycling actions, be them title clearance, assessment, remediation, site preparation, demolition, infrastructure maintenance, or other thoughts that might come to your mind. Where the domicology research has been kind of at the moment stops right now with regards to getting control of properties and finding then the cost to do one or more or all those activities. This is where the land banking industry and the practice currently is right now, looking at the need and trying to think through how the funding to actually complete the land recycling system will go. In other words, as we heard the other day with talking to some other land bankers in other states, which is that you can get control of property, and if you can find funds to do those activities, that's great. But funding, as I shown down on the right, that is right now the #1 issue across most, if not all, the land bank practitioners in the movement. And in particular, 3 activities or 3 areas need and are worthy of talking or discussing about from a practical or a policy standpoint. The first is, where does the funding come to complete the cycle, to move it to a productive reuse for those recycling actions? The second funding issue is, what about the tax revenue that's necessary to fund general local government operations? And what seemingly is the conflict, but I would submit, subject to further conversation and presentation, is actually a complementary relationship if it could be constructed that way. And third is, where does the source come, or sources come, for funding of this? Now, in the last presentation, or excuse me, the first presentation, I presented a slide which showed that there were multiple resources that have or are being used. I am personally, and as I've been talking to Ian and the practice group, am an advocate of to specifically tying tax increment financing directly to land banking and land bank owned properties at the parcel or project scale. And we're not going to get into details today talking about that, but that's worth a conversation if their desire in the practice, in the work group, or in this audience wanting to have further conversation about that. Because what it really gets down to is this issue of what are the economics of redevelopment? This is my attempt to show you, both as a practitioner, but also for private redevelopment practitioners, a pro forma, where dollars are on the y-axis and time is on the x-axis. The red line is an attempt to show that a development or redevelopment project on a parcel or rehabilitation project is going to engage a cost from day one, and at some point in time afterwards, based upon rent or sale or some disposition of the property, that one would expect that revenue would exceed cost, whereby the return on investment would be merited, and that underscores or describes the private market real estate model that we practice here in the United States. But on a redevelopment site, and I would say on almost every land bank site, because of those one or more distress factors, the normal cost line disappears, and instead it becomes the normal plus extraordinary costs line, where those extraordinary costs are those items: assessment, title clearance, cleanup, demolition, maintenance, other factors that you saw previously, and that they are extraordinary to normal, and that to ask the private market to pick up on those costs is highly problematic, because either there's insufficient revenue on sale or rents to offset that cost, or in a high value market, what forcing the market to absorb those costs will mean is raising the price for everybody, which is problematic for situations or needs like affordable housing. So where land banking as a part of the practice of redevelopment planning and recycling is focused on is finding ways to offset the cost to get close to normal, cannot get exactly to normal on one source, because if equalizing the playing field doesn't respect that there are actually two projects, there's a clean up, clean out maintenance project and a new construction project. But in policy, the need is to find the sweet spot of a cost advantage. And to the benefit that land bank or municipalities in land banking or redevelopment can find the cost advantage, that line reduction has the effect of moving the market to invest, which benefits the rest of the system, including long-term fiscal general fund revenue. So this is my last slide. It is my opinion, and as we practice here, on finding ways to combine at least two of these tools, particularly land banking, which we've been talking about today and previously, and also tax increment financing. With tax increment financing being defined in practice as being extraordinary cost reimbursement, not infrastructure construction and not direct payment to incent a developer to locate in a downtown or a community. No, it's parcel specific, task specific, and reimbursing extraordinary costs. The common denominator between these two practices are exactly the properties that we are talking about and you have in your community, and that land recycling through the land bank structure, utilizing the finance and other mechanical tools, is you guys are on your way of thinking about how that can play a role for local units and for the state of Maine. Mandy, I'll stop there. And Ian, I've been hearing the ding dongs going as I've been talking, so I assume that there might be questions out there. I'll be happy to try to respond to them.
No questions yet. I think the ding dongs are letting us know that people are coming in and out, but we can do, if everybody wants to unmute themselves when they have a question, we can just try and do it that way this time.
So I guess I really don't have a question, but I have experienced an aha moment, and then it turns out we've been doing land banks all along up here in northern Maine. In the example of Presque Isle's Industrial Council, They were given the Army Air Force Base years and years ago. And most recently, they've had great results in cleaning that up and repopulating that old base site. More recently, we have the Loring Air Force Base site, and this one is actually a state project, so a state land bank. Other examples of state land banks that I can think of now are the Juniper Ridge landfill and the landfill adjacent to the Millinocket mill site. So it's starting to all come together to me now.
All right, great comment. Thank you. Who else has a comment or question? No one has a comment or question. They must all be ready for the test, right?
This is Shelley. If there aren't additional comments or questions, maybe you want to elaborate on the tax increment financing at the parcel level.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to adjust my slide for my presentation just a minute here. I did have some. All right, let's start here. That slide right there. Okay. I'm giving you. I thought I might have time to cover some of these topics, so I pulled in some slides from other presentations that I've been giving internally here in Michigan and in other states as well. So let's talk about TIF briefly. And Shelley, I appreciate the invitation. Some of these slides also are repeats from what I presented. Was it December 6th of last year, or the first week of December last year with that in that presentation? All right, so. And as I talk to you Mainers, I believe I'm talking to a pretty knowledgeable group about TIF. But the spin I'm going to try to put today is how this can or should, if you're thinking seriously about a specific approach in land banking, getting even more focused than where you can right now on defining a parcel for TIF. And getting right to tying it on a land bank owned property, assuming you had that mechanism in place, or if you have the mechanism in place. So generally for you now, TIF is presently legal in 48 states. California, Arizona are the ones that do not, for those of you who want to know that. There are advantages and disadvantages to the tool. It has the ability to generate new revenue. And it's a program that it has generally over its 50-year life in its various connotations, operated with relative autonomy certainly from federal intervention and from states. I'm not going to tell you that there are not issues or problems with TIF because there are, not across the board, but in various specific practice realms or other activities there as well. First and foremost is a perceived or an actual conflict that might or does occur between taxing jurisdictions or other governments which levy tax within an area or on a property, and the municipality or the authority which might be adopting or operating on a TIF plan on that property as well. The other risk is that it is the creation of another local bureaucracy level. And for district TIFs, which are counting on development across a number of properties in order to pay or reimburse or cover the costs of their public financing for the major infrastructure improvements, whatever they may be, or such, that it can become a problem if the revenue growth that is projected doesn't meet out in reality. There is more than 30 years of academic and practitioner anecdotal research and reviews, all surrounding efficacy with regards to TIF. In my opinion, I would say that probably 80 to 90% of that research is positive. there are issues. They have been identified. They've been mostly tied in specific locations with specific statutes or states with specific issues or elements go. And most of the time, it's because the but-for argument is separated from the mechanics, the mechanism of the tool. So almost all the states that practice TIF allow for the prospect of creating a district, and Maine's no different, that you can establish outside of the process and approvals and such, that an area within a municipality, which would be comprised of multiple properties, would be established, and that one or more improvements would be identified for within which future tax growth would be captured and used to pay debt service or reimburse costs of that infrastructure to go. This is the original concept. It is predominant in the practice. As I said before, I think that this is well understood in Maine. A growing, albeit it's still a small, very small practice with TIF, is to focus it to the project, meaning multiple properties, as if what you would see in the top part of this slide, where a subject parcel and 2 adjacent properties might comprise a project, which is TIF for activities. Or this is not academic terminology, it's more local practitioner terminology locally here, which is focusing it down to the single property, or a micro-TIF. So the idea of a house, either new built, like in the vacant lot you see on the left, or you could even imagine a rehabilitation setting, or a commercial industrial single parcel, that if there's enough value generated, or it can sufficiently cover the cost of the extraordinary cost gap, that TIF could be constructed to operate down to the single parcel basis. Under your statutes in Maine, it's my understanding right now, in my brief review, that you can establish a district as a single parcel. So this is technically feasible to work under your statutes right now. These are the key elements that we're recommending if a redevelopment TIF at project or parcel level were to either be set up or affirmed in guidance, or even structured perhaps with specifically tied to a land bank and as eligible properties, if you all are successful with considering a bill in your legislature, that instead of districts, you look at what's an eligible property, which could be qualified by one or more criterion. Contaminated, blighted, obsolete, or could be by virtue of being owned by a land bank, it meets one or more of those qualifications. So by definition, a land bank property is an eligible property. That what you finance is not subject to interpretation by the governing body or by the review party at state level, but is in fact identified specifically in the statute by category. And what's attached to it is the need to rationalize that those costs are extraordinary to normal, which is a critical policy structure, because to be extraordinary to normal means if there is not a incentive to bring in, that the project would not occur. It's but for. Define but for. A project development plan, exactly what is intended there. It's the actual project the developer wants to undertake. The work plan is a identification of what are the specific activities and the estimated costs attached to them. And then the TIF plan, or the finance plan, is the structure of how the future capture value would be collected and or used to finance in debt service or however financing scheme for the eligible activities to go. If we were to look at this down at the micro scale, single parcel, land bank property, this slide would represent what a mechanical system could look like, meaning that the eligible property is the land bank owned property, which might qualify by one or more qualifiers that are here, and that it might have one or more eligible activities, but that if the land bank authority were to designate it or by virtue of it be owned, that a developer builder building it might be able to benefit from the future taxes to get reimbursed for the extraordinary costs plus their interest costs. The additional element that is practiced here, which if this has merit to be considered in Maine, I would be recommending you to do this, which would be to allow your TIF authority, your land bank, excuse me, to be able to also draw out of that stream administrative funds, meaning to run your operations of the land bank, and reserve funds, the ability to put money into a pool or a reserve that could be used for future projects or on projects that may not have enough revenue generation to cover the extraordinary costs. There's a lot of moving pieces in this slide. I'm going to leave this up. We've got about 15 minutes left because I want to go back to give you the opportunity to ask questions or have comments as well. We can pick up conversation on this slide or any other ones I just mentioned to you with regards to TIF. Now, understanding that the idea that I'm presenting here is that if you and the work group are moving forward to identify land banks or a structure for land banks, were you to ask, I would be recommending to you that you consider perhaps attaching TIF directly as a revenue generating source, because it addresses for your land banks one of the key questions that would rise next if you formed, which is where does your money draw? Where does your money support? Where does your financial support come from? Questions or comments?
I'm nodding my head, so yes. I'm hoping to get some feedback from everybody who's on the line here. We've been talking about this for quite some time. So I appreciate, Jim, that you walked us through what it looks like in Michigan for Michigan's land bank, how you're set up, and how you would derive funds.
One news item that you may not have known that just occurred in the last month, because I had outreach from some of my former colleagues. Quick sidebar: I worked a couple years in Vermont back over a decade ago before I came back to Michigan. I'm aware. I was told, I was approached, told that in Vermont, prior to the COVID crisis, exploding there too, that a bill went into the legislature to allow for communities to do project-based TIFs in Vermont. And there is a wide amount of support for that. And I assume that when things calm down, they may get around to reconvening the legislature and being able to have that discussion. But if Vermont were to adopt project or the capacity to do project or micro-based TIF, they would be the 20th state. 19 of the 48 states legally permit TIF to be done at both a single parcel level or project level, and the ability to utilize it for offset of developer cost for extraordinary developer costs.
Are there other questions?
So this is Alan Miller. I'm from the state of New Jersey.
Hi,
and
Alan.
I just, Jim and we met at the Brownfields conference at the end of last year. This has been a great series. I don't have a question as much as comments. Both the land banking and this TIF overview has been tremendously helpful to me. New Jersey does have a TIF-like system, not used as often as it probably should be used. And we're just getting off the ground in land banking from a state perspective. But I hope that I'm able to share this with a lot of my colleagues. I did send out some emails. A few of them were on at various points in time. But this has been a tremendous series. I don't know if this is the last one or not, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank everybody involved, and especially Jim, for presenting this and for sharing the great wealth of information that you guys did.
Well, thank you. Nice to hear from you, Ellen. Yep. Appreciate that compliment. It's been my pleasure. It is my pleasure. Yep.
Thank you, Alan.
On that note, I mean, sorry, that was great, Ellen. We would love to hear that feedback. But on that note, we would love to, if you have any other burning questions or topics that are related, we would love to hear about those. I mean, we have some time on our hands, and we're thinking about, you know, how can Build Maine really stay relevant during this time. So send them over to us anyway, through the chat, or I can put our email address in there. So thank you, everyone.
I do have a comment, I think, for the group as a whole.
Go right ahead, George.
Yes. So for those who are from Maine, I think we are getting close to a point where we should have a discussion about implementation and the mechanics of implementation in Maine specifically, and the aspects of Maine law that I think are potentially applicable, and how to do this in Maine law and within the structures of the state government in Maine or the regional organizations. So I would certainly encourage Mandy and Ian, or the folks in the group, maybe this would be a good chance to use the polling features within Zoom to find out if we're interested in doing a conference at some point here for the next week or 2 or 3 weeks on looking at how to move forward to implementation. I think we all have a pretty good understanding of purpose and a pretty good understanding of structure and what's available to us. And I think the most helpful thing for us at this point would be to move forward with a discussion on implementation.
I'm nodding my head. I'm still, you know, we were talking about this a little bit last time as far as, you know, I think the topic for this question is the need for a state level land bank. We're talking about how it was structured in Michigan and how it potentially could be structured in Maine. And I was looking at the State Housing Authority Authorization Act. And in that case, you know, that particular statute, you know, creates the Maine Housing Authority. Then it creates all the subgroups as well. And that from my perspective is the best way to go about doing that. I think we still have some additional work that needs to take place at the state level, as I mentioned earlier, to get the buy-in at that level. But we do, I think on this call and other calls, have a lot of involvement from the state council of governments across the state. But I think that's you're right, George. I think that's where we're at with this, and it'll be great to see this. I see the role. I see the role of the state involved in land banks is actually to address those properties that are just simply too large for a local unit of government to address, and that's I'll leave it at that. And you're all reading chats there, but anyways, I'll end my question. I'm seeing your face, Mandy, and you're like, you know,
No,
looks like there's a bunch of chats going on. So,
so there's a question from Stuart to everyone, which is a question that I've had as well. What has or has not worked in getting support from the commercial realtor and developer community, particularly with respect to land banks?
Well, I'll say answer from the perspective of Sanford. I think we have been successful. We've been successful with the local nonprofits, so Habitat for Humanity. We've also been successful with abutters in buying properties that we have in our inventory. We've also been working with local realtors with these properties. Where we're not as successful, or we'd like to be more successful, is redevelopment, and that's you know, a vacant lot that has water and sewer, for example, is putting a new building on it, and that's just simply it. And I think that's just I view it as a question, an answer of will versus a answer of money. At least that's the way it works out in the market in Sanford. Is that what your question was, Stuart?
Well, while we're waiting for a response, I'll give you a perspective from here. I'm dating myself because it goes back over 10 years. The land bank structure in Michigan took a little while to get accepted by the actors in the real estate industry. I'll use that phrase. It was driven on two areas. One was, I think, the lack of understanding about these issues that surround distressed properties. And second was on the part of some of the practitioners, not the organizations of the trade groups, but a number of the practitioners. I'll describe it as philosophical, which is that there, perhaps with some folks or some groups, there might be a presumption that these issues are best resolved by the private market acting or not acting, which provides message to folks on value or feasibility and the like. And it took a few years and a fair amount of discussion to point out what I consider to be the issue that was obviously at the edge of in front of their face, at the point of their nose. No offense to those folks, but that thinking doesn't match the reality that I suspect all of you look at with some of these properties in your communities. In other words, if it was just left to the private market to resolve and absorb these properties, a fair number of them would never move, which is really not the market saying no, it's the market having the inability of piece playing to put a project or a recycling use together to recycle the property. And so it took a few years, but the trade groups here have come to embrace the concept of land banking, or land recycling actually, and have actually built a dimension of their practice on utilizing the incentive tools and programs to actually help them move properties by proactively looking to see if helping them get into the land banks.
I agree. We find that our biggest partner here in Sanford are the banks. This is a way for them to get the monkey off their back. Once they quickly came to realize that. But yeah, these are properties that are stuck and that need government intervention to get them out, unfortunately.
Yeah. One other aspect of success here, it's in early nascent stage. But it's showing some promise, again, prior to the COVID crisis. Is something that you all are thinking about too, and that is developing a system to produce or manufacture, as I like to call it, small scale developers. The IncDev system, Mandy's shaking her head. Yeah, I mean, you guys are talking about having some sort of process where you would actually cause to be created small scale onesie twosie lot developers and give them opportunity to grow and practice across the state in various local municipalities. This type of work with a land bank, with land banking, with micro-TIF to support gap costs on sale or lease of properties structured to require performance, as you described. We've seen in our small test areas, those would be Kalamazoo and believe it or not, a couple of neighborhoods in Flint. We've seen really good success both in new construction of not just detached single, but into small missing middle product, and also the start in the Carriagetown neighborhood in Flint in rehabilitation. so, not across the board, but the right type of property that has rehabilitation. This idea of micro-TIF or gap on housing subsidy that's worth talking with the working group. I'm willing to do that.
Mhm.
It has to be the right type of project with not too much of a gap, which hits the missing middle affordability range, not the deep affordability, but the missing middle affordability range, and might be a benefit to if you produce small scale developers.
Yeah, and Build Maine is working on bringing Incremental Development Alliance, aka IncDev, to town. We are talking about it for September, though things may change a little bit. And we're working with the Maine Association of Realtors on a grant to sort of fund that. So if anybody has some extra funds laying around, let us know. But we have one final question. I think we've got about 2 minutes left. So Kate is asking, is characterization as recycling helpful in communicating benefits to buy-in, to get buy-in, excuse me?
I'll interpret that as a question for me, Mandy, and the answer to me is yes. We've gone around in a couple of terms, the past 5 or 6 years. I've talked today about redevelopment TIF. In our state, the technical term is brownfield TIF. Now, when someone uses the term brownfield, I'm even looking at some of you right now. I can see your facial reactions. In the public, people think of brownfield and they think perhaps negatively about those sites. So it's finding ways to get people in their minds or with visuals to see where not what's there now, but where this could go, what it could be. And so using terms like recycling to productive reuse, showing imagery of what could be reuses on the site, all those come together to give the practitioners and the public a sense of not just being a money dump, but being a process which is tied to an outcome and needs to be structured and incentive to achieve that outcome.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining. We will keep you up to date. I've been adding people to our email list, so that's how we're communicating mostly. And be sure to check out our Facebook page if you need some good light reading. And yeah, thank you so much to Jim again, and Ian and George and Shelley and Kara and the whole planning team. So we really appreciate all the time that everybody's put into these, not just during the call, but before and